The snow had already begun to fall when they brought her to the ranch, fine as sifted flour on the wind. It clung to the hem of her threadbare dress, to the ends of her loose braid, to lashes too long and eyes too quiet. She said nothing when they handed her down from the wagon. Just stood there, hands clasped in front of her like a prayer, eyes fixed on the ground until they were told to look up. He stood on the porch, one shoulder braced against a warped beam, arms crossed. The scarf of his coat blew back in the wind to reveal a long scar that began at his jaw and vanished into the collar of his shirt. It ran jagged like lightning, pink and puckered, and no one ever asked where it came from. She looked at it once, then looked away, and for that he was quietly grateful. Name, his voice had the grit of someone who hadn't spoken much in a while. She blinked snowflakes from her lashes. Marigold, she said, though it was not the name she was born with. The man's mouth twitched, not a smile, just a faint shift. You're older than I asked for, he muttered. She's strong, does what she's told, said the broker who'd ferried her out. You'll find no better. He nodded once, fine. No one said goodbye. The broker left with a half-hearted salute and the jangle of reins, wagon wheels cracking over frozen ruts. Marigold didn't watch him go. She waited. For what, she wasn't sure. Orders, perhaps, or kindness. Neither came. Barn's full, the man said at last. You'll stay in the back room of the house, it ain't much. I don't need much, she replied, and followed him without another word. The house was built of timber, gray and leaning with age. Inside, it smelled of ash and cold iron. There was a fire in the hearth, but it hadn't been tended in hours, the flame low and petulant. She saw no signs of a woman's hand, no lace curtains, no polished brass, no gentle scent of lavender or soap, just dust and solitude and silence. He showed her the back room with a nod. It held a narrow cot, a basin, and a single wool blanket folded at the foot. Water in the pump out back. You'll rise early, cook clean, feed the animals. If I'm working fence, you'll come with. Yes, sir. He flinched at that. Don't call me sir. She nodded. What should I call you? He hesitated, jaw working. Call me Elijah. She said his name like a vow, Elijah. That winter crawled slow across the valley, laying white fingers on every fence post and pine bough. Marigold rose before light and boiled coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She patched torn shirts, hauled feed, milked the sullen old cow who never kicked her once. Elijah said little, watched her from the corner of his eye. She never flinched under his gaze, but neither did she seek it. Some days she rode out with him to mend the fence line where snowdrifts had buckled the posts. He'd hand her wire, and she'd twist it with raw fingers, her breath pluming in the sharp air. One day he watched her strip her gloves to work barehanded and said, "You'll ruin your skin." "They're ruined already," she replied softly. He didn't argue after that. He had no appetite for talk. She had no habit of it, yet somehow the silences began to ease. Not warm, not yet, but no longer sharp. Like walking a trail after snow has crusted it, still cold but firm underfoot. It wasn't until the second month she asked him, "Do you have family?" He didn't look up from the leather harness he was oiling. Had. That was all he said. And all she needed. Each night she scrubbed her hands clean and stared into the fire until her thoughts softened. Sometimes she wondered if her life before this place had been a fevered dream. The brothel, the buyers, the endless passing from one hard hand to another. Here, at least, the air was clean. Here, no one touched her without cause. She would take that and be grateful. Once she found a photograph half buried under a drawer of a woman with a proud tilt to her chin and a boy too old to be called that, too young to be a man. She didn't ask, just wiped the dust from the frame and set it on the mantel. When Elijah found it there, he said nothing. But that night, he fed the fire with fresh logs and let it burn bright. Spring was a long way off, but the icicles began to weep ever so faintly. By the time the thaw came, the land had remembered how to breathe again. The creeks, once locked beneath ice, ran cold and quick, threading through the valley like veins of silver. Snowmelt soaked the earth, thick with the scent of mud and old pine, and the cattle stood shin-deep in water, bleeding for higher ground. Marigold had taken to walking the fence-line at dawn, a quiet ritual before the day's labor. She moved with purpose but not haste, her boots heavy with wet soil, skirt tucked high beneath her coat. She liked the hush of the hour, the way the mountains held back the sun until the sky went pale with waiting. Elijah found her out there once, leaning on a split rail, watching a red hawk wheel above the ridgeline. He didn't call out, just stood a few paces off, studying the line of her shoulders, the tilt of her head. She looked like she belonged to the silence. "You tracking something?" he asked finally. She turned her head. "No, just thinking." "Dangerous pastime. Sometimes it's the only one left." He huffed a breath, not quite laughter. "You always talk like that." "Like what?" "Like you've been reading poems in your sleep." She smiled. "Maybe I have." That morning he let her ride his second horse, a pale roan named Bishop, though he hadn't let anyone else touch the gelding in 3 years. She didn't ask why. Just set her hand on Bishop's neck and murmured something low, something soft, and the animal settled under her touch like an old dog. They rode to the northern pasture where wind had splintered the fence. Elijah set to work with hammer and nail, but his right shoulder stiffened halfway through and he cursed low, voice rough with strain. Marigold stepped in without a word, holding the rail steady while he drove the iron home. Their hands brushed once, knuckles cold and scraped, and neither pulled away. "You carry an injury," she said after a time, not a question but a knowing. He didn't look at her. "War took part of me, fire took the rest." She didn't flinch. "You lived." "Doesn't always feel like it." She glanced toward the tree line, where green buds had begun to stir. "Sometimes survival's the bravest thing we do." Elijah worked until dusk without speaking again, but that night he left her a jar of honey on the kitchen table, thick and amber bright. She found it at sunrise and ran her finger through the sweetness like a child. For the first time in years, she licked the sugar from her skin and didn't cry. As the days lengthened, so did their rhythm. They planted a small garden behind the barn, though the soil was stubborn and the seeds reluctant. Marigold tended it like a child left on her doorstep, patient and watchful. Elijah carved her a new hoe handle when the old one split, sanded smooth as river stone. Once she caught him watching her in the late light, his gaze not harsh or wanting, just curious, as if trying to memorize the shape of someone who might stay. She asked him, one warm evening, about the boy in the photograph. "My son," he said, voice hoarse. "Gone." Elijah nodded. He was 16. Fever took him in 3 days. "And his mother." He closed his eyes, carried the grief in her chest till it split her heart. Marigold touched his arm, light as rain. "I'm sorry." "I don't know how to carry anyone else," he whispered. "You don't have to, just walk beside me." He looked at her then, truly looked. Not as a purchase, not as a stranger, but as a soul standing in her own ruin and refusing to kneel. That night the fire crackled louder, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of something unnamed. Summer came without fanfare, seeping into the valley slow as molasses. The snow had long melted from the peaks, and now the grass stood knee-high in the pastures, golden and thick. The cattle grew fat and lazy in the heat, and the river dropped low enough for barefoot wading. Marigold had taken to humming as she worked, quiet songs without words, like wind in dry wheat. Elijah noticed but said nothing. He'd begun to walk with her more, their shoulders brushing as they checked the fences, as they led the cattle to graze. He moved easier now, the stiffness in his shoulder loosening under the heat, or maybe under her gaze. One day she coaxed a newborn calf to suckle from a bottle while its mother stood fretful and hollow-eyed. Elijah watched from the doorway of the barn, arms folded, face unreadable. When the calf finally latched, Marigold laughed, a sound like river bells, and something in Elijah's chest pulled taut. Later he carved her a whistle from a willow branch and left it on the porch rail without a note. She picked it up, turned it in her hands, and played it once, soft, tremulous, like a sparrow's call. He heard it from the fields and smiled into the dust. They spoke more now, not always with words. He would pass her a cup of coffee without being asked, and she'd pour the last of the stew into his bowl before her own. He fixed the latch on her door when it started to stick, and she sewed a patch onto the inside of his coat where the lining had frayed. One morning they found a fox caught in a rusted trap along the edge of the property, its leg mangled and raw. Elijah raised his rifle, but Marigold stepped in front of him. "There's another way," she said, voice low. He didn't argue, only lowered the weapon and let her work. She freed the fox with steady hands and dressed the wound with old linen and pine sap. The creature limped off, blood bright against the grass. Elijah stared after it a long time. "I would have killed it," he said. "I know," she replied, "but it still would have died afraid." That night he sat beside her on the porch as the stars came out one by one. The wind had softened, and the crickets had begun their long, rhythmic song. He reached over and touched her hand, gently, like someone who'd never been taught how to ask. She didn't move away, just let her fingers curl around his like vines seeking warmth. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Every day," she said, "but I never do." "Why not?" She turned to him, her eyes catching the fire glow from the window behind them. "Because here, I'm not owned, I just belong." He swallowed hard. You do belong." To say the words cost him, but once said, they changed the air between them. After that, he started calling her Goldie when the sun was strong and she was laughing in the field. At first, she didn't answer. Then one day she said, "That was my mother's name." Would she have liked it here? She liked anywhere that wasn't a locked door. A storm rolled in midsummer, wild and mean. Lightning struck a pine near the barn, and the fire leapt quick and ravenous. They worked side by side, hauling water, screaming at the animals to run. When it was over, when the smoke curled low and the barn still stood though half-charred, Elijah collapsed in the mud, coughing, ash streaked down his face. Marigold knelt beside him, pressed her palm to his chest. "You're breathing," she said. He took her hand and kissed her wrist, reverent. "So are you." They sat there in the blackened field, soaked and shivering, but together. By autumn the hills flared with color, gold, rust, crimson, like the earth itself had caught fire one last time before sleep. The wind turned sharp and the mornings came dressed in frost. Marigold had taken to wearing Elijah's old flannel over her dress, the sleeves rolled and the hem brushing her thighs. He never asked for it back. The barn, though scarred by flame, still stood, its bones strong. Together they had repaired what was broken. New planks replaced the blackened ones, fresh nails gleamed like dew in the morning light. Inside, it smelled of new hay and oil, a mingling of past and future. Elijah had softened, though he still spoke in short bursts, like every word cost him something. But when he looked at her, it was different now, less guarded, more tethered. Sometimes she caught him watching her hands as she shelled beans or stitched a seam, as if he still didn't quite believe she was real. One night after supper, she found him on the porch, carving another piece of wood. It was a sparrow this time, wings tucked, eyes small and patient. He handed it to her without a word. She traced the tiny feathers with a fingertip, her breath caught somewhere between memory and hope. "You're learning to speak," she said softly. "I'm learning to listen," he corrected. They were different now, not healed, not whole. Such words did not belong to people like them, but changed. Bent toward one another like trees that had grown up wind-beaten, each shaping the other's silhouette. When word came from town that another man had asked after her, offering money, threats, reminders, Elijah rode out before she could speak. He returned 2 days later, bruised and bloodied but silent. She said nothing, just took his coat and bathed his knuckles, her touch steady. "Did you kill him?" she asked, not with fear but with calm. "No, I told him who you are now, and what I'll do if he forgets." Her hands stilled on his skin. "Who am I, Elijah?" He looked up at her then, the side of his face where the scar lived half in shadow. "You're mine, but not like before, not like the way they meant it." Her eyes welled, though no tears fell. "Say it again." "You're mine because you chose me." She kissed his temple, his jaw, the ragged edge of his old wound. He did not flinch. In her touch he heard no pity, only promise. That first frost, they slaughtered the hog together, hands slick with blood and breath steaming in the air. It was brutal work, but necessary. She sang while they hung the meat, not to celebrate, but to honor the weight of taking and giving. Elijah listened, the song filling the barn like smoke. They shared a bed by then, but still lay apart for many nights, close enough to feel warmth but not to reach. One evening he turned toward her and whispered, "I want to sleep without fear." "You can," she said. "You already do." In her dreams, she no longer ran. In his, the fire no longer chased him. Their wounds remained, but they were no longer open. When the last leaves fell and the first snow clung to the roof, she stood beside him on the porch, their breath rising in twin clouds. Below them, the fields rested under frost, and the fences held. I used to think survival was the best I could hope for, he said. She reached for his hand, and now I hope for spring. Winter returned, not with cruelty but with ceremony. The valley quieted beneath its weight, each branch bowed in white, each trail vanished beneath a fresh hush. It was a season for stillness, for keeping close to the fire, for remembering who you'd chosen to weather it with. Marigold woke first most mornings, her breath ghosting into the cold before the stove was stoked. She'd wrap herself in Elijah's coat and pad through the house barefoot, her steps soft as snowfall. In that silence, she could hear the house breathe, the settling groan of timbers, the low hum of the wind between walls. Elijah took to building things that winter. Not just repairs, but small tokens, new shelves for her herbs, a cradle for kindling, a carved hook for her shawl. One evening, she found him fashioning a hairbrush from pine and boar bristle. He'd never made one before, but she didn't tell him. Just sat behind him, combed her fingers through his hair until the sun dropped behind the hills. They had built a life not by planning, but by staying. Each day added another stone to the house inside them, not made of walls, but of presence. When the first calf came early, slick and shaking in the cold, Marigold wrapped it in her shawl and carried it to the kitchen. Elijah didn't question it. They fed it by firelight, steam rising from the bottle, its body small enough to hold between their arms. "We'll call him Ash," she said, "for what he rose from." Elijah looked at her then, the way he often did now, steady, undone. "You ever think we deserved this?" he asked. She thought of the years she'd lost, the faces she'd left behind. The bruises, the hunger, the cold hands of men who never learned her name. "No," she said, "but we made it anyway." Spring came late that year, as if the earth itself had hesitated to believe in gentleness. But come it did. Shoots broke through the snow. The river fattened. Calves dropped strong and bawling. Bees returned to the hive Elijah had rescued from the old oak. One morning he brought her a ring made from horsehair and brass. It wasn't fine. It wasn't polished. But it was shaped by his hands and bound by his heart. She slid it onto her finger and kissed the palm that offered it. They married in the pasture, under a sky so blue it looked washed clean. No preacher, no witness but the wind, just the two of them and the sparrow that landed on the fence post as they spoke the only vows they'd ever need. "I stay." So they stayed. Years passed not in silence but in harmony. The pain never vanished. They did not forget. But their love grew like the trees along the ridge, gnarled, beautiful, reaching for light. When Marigold grew heavy with child, Elijah wept in the barn alone, not for fear but for awe. She birthed the boy in the house she'd first entered with her head bowed and hands folded. She named him Samuel, after her father, and placed him in Elijah's arms beneath a quilt stitched with years of threadbare love. At night, when the baby cried, it was Elijah who rose, who rocked him by the hearth with a lullaby hummed in a voice scarred but sure. Marigold would watch from the doorway, hand resting on the ring he made her. She was not his salvation, he was not her rescuer, but they were each other's beginning. And for the rest of their long, ordinary, hard, and blessed days, they chose one another, every morning, every storm, every thaw. Until the end.